Welcome to Practical AI in Healthcare, the podcast that cuts through the noise to spotlight real-world solutions delivering real-world value. From patient care to clinical research, from life sciences to patient engagement, we focus on what truly matters in healthcare today. No hype, no theory, just practical insights where AI is making a true impact. Dr. Stephen Lapkoff and Dr. Leanne Rosenblit are your hosts as we explore what's real and moving the needle in this exciting new domain. Welcome aboard and let's get to it. Last September, the DCI Network hosted its inaugural Signal Through the Noise Healthcare AI Conference in Boston. It brought together healthcare delivery leaders, technology innovators, government officials, and engaged patients. We explored some of the most important real-world use cases in healthcare AI. This year, from September 23rd to the 25th, we'll reconvene in Boston for the next chapter, Signal Through the Noise, From Proof to Practice, Scaling Enterprise AI Across Healthcare Systems and Biopharma. The question this year is simple but urgent. Once we found the signal in the noise, how do we turn promising AI pilots into sustainable, trustworthy implementations across the healthcare ecosystem? If you're a fan of the podcast, we'd love to have you join the conversation live in Boston. Podcast listeners can receive 30% discounts on their registration with the discount code PracticalAI30. Come join us this September for Signal Through the Noise, From Proof to Practice. We hope to see you there. Hello, welcome to this week's edition of Practical AI in Healthcare. My name is Dr. Stephen Lapkoff, and I'm here as I am every week with my colleague, Dr. Leanne Rosenblit. Leon, how's it going today?
Oh, good, Steve. Really looking forward to reflecting on this batch of episodes. It was a rich vein of, some valuable ore that I think we get to explore.
We are, as you just pointed out, we're about to go through our seventh Reflections episode, which means we're all the way up to episode number 50. Can you believe it? We've done 50 of these things since last summer. We're almost at a year.
Feels like 80, to be honest with you. No, just kidding. No, I can believe it because I believe in a computer when it tells me, and I can count the sheets. But it's a lot of episodes, and I think we both feel similarly that we're pretty privileged in being able to sit at this intersection of commercial efforts and academic conversations and folks who are working at large care provider institutions to try to get a really binocular vision of where the field is going. So it's been just such an interesting journey, and I can't wait to reflect on it. But I think the plan is to do kind of an annual review next episode, because it's been 50, and number 52 is going to be year in review. But this one, I think we owe our last 7 guests a little bit of thinking, right? I mean, we talked to them in depth, and there were just some really interesting conversations. And I think we want to focus on just those last 7 before we think about the year as a whole.
I think that's exactly right. And let me just review who the 7 people are that we spoke with. We spoke with Mika Newton. Mika is with XCures, and our conversation revolved around intelligent interoperability. Peter Embi, who is currently at Vanderbilt University, and we were talking with him about his own personal journey in medicine and how he's working with AI and helping to deal with things like algorithmic vigilance and creating a sort of an air traffic control tower for AI models. And you took Vimla Patel on your own. I was on vacation that week. She is into cognitive science and told some pretty hair-raising stories, and one of them which really resonated with me. We can dive into that a little bit. Renee Deehan, who is looking at trusted AI for consumer health. Christine Dymek, who's former AHRQ, and her focus was on AI literacy. And finally, Jeremy Harper, who was looking at sort of broken adoption curves in healthcare. And I think that gives us a lot of fodder for discussion today. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think our goal today is not going to be to recap the episodes, because I think we want to encourage our listeners to go back and catch up on them if they missed them. They were all really fantastic conversations, but to just think more deeply about what we learned from each one and maybe pull in a couple of threads that connect them at the end. That's how I was thinking about it.
Absolutely.
Do you want to get us started?
Sure.
With Mika?
Yeah. So Mika Newton, as I said earlier, is the CEO of a company called XCures. And for transparency's sake, I used to be an advisor to the company when it was earlier, about 3 or 4 years ago. Um, and that's how I know him actually, through some work that we've done together. Uh, his organization is working on how you generate data in large provider for large provider organizations by mining EHR data. And he's doing it in a way that you and I, Leon, we actually tried to when we were both working at the MMRF, the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and we found it not just difficult, but like painfully hard.
Yeah, and it wasn't the MMRF. I mean, just to be clear, it was the state of the art wasn't there, right? But in a Prometheus research, we've been trying to take the approach of patient mediated data ingestion since I'd say 2018 was, I think, our first project. I believe it was Cure SMA. Why? But, the roadmap was written, right? Everybody kind of said, yeah, it looks like the regulations are going to where every provider institution is going to have a FHIR endpoint. Everybody agrees that that's the standard is going to be, and because and the patient is going to have the ability to request the data from every institution. We want to go through the patient and get data aggregated that way. So it was a core design direction of a lot of really innovative multimodal registry efforts, including many of the projects that I've worked on and some that you've worked on. And it never worked as well as it should have, right? At the time, it was the difficulties were enormous, so we could talk about what some of them are. But I think what Mika's told us was genuinely surprising is that infrastructure that we were thinking should work actually does work now, at least to some extent. And I'll be honest, that kind of blew my mind, right? Because as somebody who's been in the industry for a while, you get used to certain things just not working, and you kind of go, "Yeah, it was a nice thing, nice attempt, but it didn't. It just doesn't work the way it's advertised." And then when it starts to work, that's a real ground shift.
And you're absolutely right. And one of the things that strikes me is that it wasn't necessarily an AI thing that switched, right? It was certain laws came into practice, policies changed, and technology caught up. I mean, it was a confluence of a lot of things. And that gave what was a painfully difficult task, in other words, ingesting data from medical records at scale, or even not even at scale, just getting them in, but Meek is doing it at scale, all of a sudden went from being painfully hard to being, I wouldn't say painfully easy, but I would say far more achievable. And Mika actually took it up a notch or two or three and is now moving data around it at a scale that neither you nor I think, ever anticipated. We hoped for it, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is an AI part to the story. I mean, you're right that the fundamental infrastructure, 21st Century Cures Act, TEFCA, the various standards, in this case, CDA, had to be in place. But I think for Mika's team to do what they're doing, they also needed a very efficient way to write data transformation rules.
Yes.
And that would have been very difficult to do without modern large language model type AIs that can write simple transformation code really efficiently. So my sense is it's definitely bringing together those capabilities that's making it possible, but it is nevertheless transformative in the industry. I mean, the vision of the patient being an access point, I think, if we were to take Mika and others who are in that vein seriously, is becoming real, and in a slightly different way than we anticipated. I mean, I think, if you asked us or anybody else working in the field, what would have been the data exchange standards, you would have said FHIR, of course, right? That's what everybody's pushing. The fact that it's CDA is a little surprising. Not like, if you think about it, it's like, yeah, it's a reasonable standard to use. I mean, it's XML, it's a little heavy, but so we had a cool conversation with Mika about why that was, and I think that's also worth diving into. So I just want to point folks back to that episode. I really think it's very important to understand that there's a fundamental change in the kind of piping that we can now set up for data coming out of provider organizations, and it's just fascinating. So I don't know if you want to move on to the next one to say anything more
I- I'll
about.
I'll just close out with by saying that it's not that often in your, it's kind of funny. In my lifetime, I didn't think I'd be witnessing the degree of transformational changes across healthcare or healthcare data at the pace they're happening. I just didn't anticipate it being the way it's turning out. And to your point, AI is absolutely a part of the story with Xcures, because that gives them the scale. But the other piece of the equation that had to be there too was the standards had to be in place, and the laws and policies had to also be in place. And it just seems like it all happened in a confluence of activity, and they all generated these a miraculous transformation, kind of at the same time. But absolutely, yeah. Let's move on to the next episode, which was our good friend Peter Embi. And
Yeah, and we love Peter. I mean, everybody loves Peter who knows him, right? He's just a wonderful guy and just a fantastic leader in the informatics community at AMIA, who served in leadership roles. So he's now at Vanderbilt, right?
Mhm.
Sorry, he has so many jobs that
Yes.
I forget which one he's at the moment. But he's got some very interesting initiatives. He's advancing there. He was early to the table to talk about algorithm vigilance, right? I think it was before the big AI explosion. I think that term, the paper goes back to at least 2019. Apologies if I'm misremembering, but where he was thinking about the algorithms that we use, not just machine learning, but any computations that are impacting how patients are diagnosed and treated. And he pointed out that we need a way to monitor how well they're doing, if there are new risks. And obviously, with the inclusion of increasing amount of automation some of which we're calling AI, that needs a more systematic effort. So you and I have worked on this with the DCI network under the rubric of healthcare AI governance. Peter's got a real initiative at his institution that he calls Vamos. That's really worth understanding, where he is looking at, he's looking at transparency and reportability of AI models. So what did you think was the most interesting thread from that conversation,
Well,
Steve?
there were a couple of other threads. I'll get in. Let's stay with Vamos for a second, because we have been sort of pushing for um, some type of way for the some type of reporting mechanism for uh, errors that AI makes. I mean, just like my background's in pharmaceuticals, and the MedWatch system lays out a pretty reasonable approach to reporting adverse events. And as we pointed out many, many times in the podcast, it doesn't exist right now in healthcare AI, and that's where the governance comes in. That's where the work at DCI comes in. Peter's actually taken it to a new level and built this thing called Vamos, which is actually doing what we've been asking for quite a while. He's in a position where he can actually build. We're not in that situation ourselves at the moment, but it's amazing that he has. And it's the kind of thing that, if you're protecting for a couple of things. Number one, you're protecting for algorithmic drift. You're protecting for errors that happen in the system, and you're able to then make them visible so that somebody can do something about it. And at the moment, that's not such an easy thing to do. Uh, it also
Yeah.
tickles the issue about medical legal issues in AI, but we'll leave that for another day.
Yeah, so Peter described it very nicely as kind of air traffic control for AI systems. One interesting thing about what they're building is I mean, it's institutional effort, right? So they're doing it within an institution, and they are open sourcing it so others can use it and contribute to it. But it doesn't quite get to one of the ideas that you were pushing, which is MedWatch for AI, right? We need the equivalent of a MedWatch system that monitors industry wide what's
Right.
happening and
It's not.
alerts people to errors. So it's not quite that, but it's showing us a way we could get there, I think, right?
It's an MVP for him, I think. Don't you think?
I didn't
It's the
look at it
beginning.
closely enough. Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's a good approach to start at an institutional level and then think about how that aggregates. So I'm generally a fan of sort of starting small and piloting
Right.
on a small
Exactly.
scale, and before you build like gigantic system that forces everybody to behave the same way. So I'm confident it's a really good approach. I don't know if it's an MVP of a global system or
Well,
merely a directional pointer, but there is. So one thing, other thing that came out of that conversation that I thought, that's one of my pet themes. I don't want to call it a pet peeve because it's really just a question that I keep asking, which is, to what extent is AI just IT, right? We've talked before, and it comes up repeatedly that in our conversations that AI is an ill-defined category. Most consumers think of just LLM chatbots. Folks who are building AI are often thinking quite broadly about machine learning and other sophisticated computational models. But we are all talking about different things, and there's a possibility of enormous confusion. So, the question I like to pose to folks who are building governance tools or thinking about how to bring AI to clinical practice is, what do you mean by AI and how is it different from IT, right? Information technology, whatever AI is, we know it fits under information technology, but how well, which sub piece of information technology is it? And Peter was, very thoughtful on this. I mean, he could have easily argued both sides of the argument, and he has. I know for a fact that, that he's argued it both ways. And I thought he handled it really, really well. He points out that there are, even if the label is vague, there's certainly things that we want to govern carefully, right? And I encourage everybody to go and listen to that part of the conversation. I think it's an important one.
I want to just point out that he had another part of his interview which wasn't completely around AI, but it was very interesting, and it harkened back to another episode we did with another physician named Barry Chaikin, where
Mm.
and I won't go into the details of it, but Peter very openly talks about a rare disease that he had that nearly killed him, that went undiagnosed for like 15 years. And it's one of those cautionary tales for us physicians, probably more than the general public, because physicians aren't the best patients. And even though we know the book knowledge around what's going on, sometimes we don't pay attention when it's ourselves that are in the line of fire. And both he pointed that out, and so did Barry Chaikin. And again, if you want to hear more about that story, and it's a very important story to tell, go back and listen to Peter's episode. I think maybe we should move on to the next piece. And this was the one you ran solo with Vimla Patel.
Yeah, it was a delight to talk to her. For those of you who don't in the audience who haven't heard of Vimla, she's a seminal figure in bringing cognitive science to healthcare, and she was the first person to write about AI in healthcare. And she wrote about it from a cognitive science point of view. I think the discovery she's best known for is her work in physician reasoning. She found that expert clinicians um, don't reason the way we may think from general rules and hypotheses to a conclusion. Instead, they reason directly from the data to a diagnosis, right? So they look at the big pattern of the data points. They select the ones that are really relevant very quickly and intuitively, and they say, "Yep, I know what that is," right? So, in contrast, novices, like medical students or folks working outside of their field, who are being asked to sort of look at a medical problem they're not familiar with, will engage in this kind of systematic, what she calls backwards reasoning, right, where you kind of generate a hypothesis and you test it against various rules and evidence. This maps onto the Kahneman and Tversky's system one, system two reasoning, but it has really interesting implications for how we build clinical AI. I think a lot of folks building clinical decision support systems assume that physicians are engaged in the slow backwards mode, right? They're trying to reason through a problem by generating a hypothesis and ruling out evidence. And the result, they present more data, longer differential lists more screens, and that's not the way that experts do it, right? And a design that helps a novice drags an expert's performance down into novice performance. So I think that's a fascinating insight, that you cannot build a system that supports both experts and novices in the same using the same user interface, and you really have to think about those kinds of users working differently.
You know, I couldn't make that episode. I was on holiday that week, but I I did listen to it, and I have known Vimla for like 25 years,
Yeah.
and one of the stories she told in her episode was about a case of a patient who got an overdose of potassium chloride, Now, if you're hypokalemic, that can kill you. If you become hyperkalemic, that likewise can kill you. And if a EMR system doesn't give information in a timely way to let the residents know or the doctors know that a lab has been corrected, and then the resident just gives more of the same medicine, all of a sudden you end up with a very consequential issue, which is around, in this case, it was a hyperkalemic overdose. It rang true to something that happened to me when I was, or not even me, my girlfriend in medical school, who had another consequence of a patient getting colchicine, too much colchicine, which is a drug for gout, and how that cascaded through the system and nobody caught it. Um, I think Vimla's perspective on that was that, our systems need to be made smarter to sort of get in front of those types of issues, that they should theoretically be able to close loops faster and more effectively so that those are never happen events, right? It's like, don't ever cut off the wrong leg in a surgery, never
Mhm.
allow a drug to ever become overprescribed because of a systemic error like that. And I think the episode points out the details of that case, and I think it's worth a listen to
Yeah.
go back and hear that.
No, I had the same reaction. I'm like, man, what a great case study, right? And she's taught it before, and I think she told it really well. I think that case study and your observation also has design lessons for increasing the level of automation. So the automated interfaces not only can downgrade experts to novice performance inadvertently, they can also reduce friction so much that human decision making atrophies. And one perhaps paradoxical conclusion of Vimla's insight is that you may want to build friction back in, right? You may want to build specific points of friction where the system pauses and asks the clinician, do you want to accept this, right? Are you sure, right? And does it in a way that forces real thinking and real decision making, as opposed to training people to just click the accept button, which I know we're all guilty of with, when we have automation that's good, right? So
We we've called that out very early on in at the DCI in the first year that we
yeah,
brought this out around this issue of, I don't want
automation
to.
bias is it's
Is it
the
automation bias? Is that the label we want to use? It's like
that's I mean that's generally the way it's been referred to in the literature. It's that people tend to accept when a system presents you with the right answer 99% of the time, you're just gonna
accept
accept it.
the
I mean,
answer.
it has actually two different. I just realized it has multiple meanings. I mean, one of them is that people generally, especially young people, assume that computers give you the right answer.
Yes,
So
exactly.
sometimes it's they're like, oh, but the AI system said this, so it must be true. But I think more generally it refers to that process of accepting automated answers that are generally right. I mean, it was well studied with like the TSA screeners in airports, right? Because you rarely actually find a bomb. The TSA staff were just waving stuff through that looked marginal, which is why good training programs developed red teaming. They would actually show up with something that what they were
Look like a
supposed to
bomb.
catch.
Yes,
Yeah, and it was like, whoa, hey, wait a minute, that's not a sock. I need to. That's something else. So,
but when
I
you
mean, I
say
think that
when you say building in the friction, I mean, I think that's the one of the keys here, because one of my concerns has been, and that's the exact concern, like the more you become dependent on these systems and they give you right answers and you let down your guard and you don't double check or you don't triple check, and even with a human in the loop, if that human becomes complacent, that's going to lead to medical errors. It's going to lead to terrible outcomes. And I think Vimla pointed that out particularly well here.
yeah, and if you remember back, our friend Amy Price, who was on
Oh yeah.
earlier, talked about that it's not just a human in a loop; it's a knowledgeable human who
Yeah.
cares,
Yep.
right? And a knowledgeable human who cares is paying attention and is looking to make judgments that improve the outcome. So unfortunately, when technology ignores how clinicians think and work, it doesn't just fail, it quietly sets the stage for smart people to make really dangerous mistakes. So one lesson we could take from cognitive science and from Vimla's work is learning when to think fast, when to think slow, and when to stop and think for yourself, even in environments where automation is often giving you correct answers. So let's move on to Renee Deehan. What can you remind us what her episode was about, Steve?
So her episode was about a company that she works for called Inside Tracker, and they're looking at a recommendation engine, which is not primarily an LLM per se. They're trying to take knowledge representations and reasoning and symbolic AI with deterministic rules and merge the two in a way so that they're looking at whether they can make healthcare recommendations, maybe not prescriptions, drugs or therapies in that way, but more like off over the counter things like that, and how to change ways of living so that you can be healthier and have less long term problems in your life. And they merged this concept of these deterministic rules with the AI engine in a very interesting way. She went very carefully into not wanting to say they can find causality, but it is directionally pushing in a way that is helping patients get into a healthier lifestyle with hopefully better outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed talking to her. I think she talked to us as a scientist and was transparent about the difficulties that their approach is undertaking. So they've taken on a really difficult problem. The problem is, how do you make evidence-based recommendations about lifestyle changes? What supplements to take, how much exercise is worth doing, right? How to change your sleep habits. It's a difficult area because the evidence base there is usually not RCTs. It's some studies that have been done, and a lot of noise, right? So you have to pick out the studies. You have to figure out which do they agree or do they conflict. How strong is the evidence? And their work has been about trying to identify and select sufficiently highly graded evidence so you can make recommendations in a space that's otherwise very noisy. So I'm personally really interested in that. I think that's a key problem for our age, right? Is how to get how to discover quality evidence in a noisy environment, especially when there are people who are motivated to mislead you, right? So there's lots of in that industry. There's an awful lot of snake oil salesmen
Yeah.
who are trying to sell you nonsense, right, and are making a lot of money from it.
They're
So go ahead, Steve. Sorry.
they're going to they're trying to do it the right way though. They did a big study, a 20,000 person study, looking at blood
Yeah.
glucose A1Cs, hemoglobin A1Cs, who were in the pre-diabetic range and having their intervention. And they're trying to show, and they've got a publication out of it that showed that it actually had an effect. Also with the LDLs. And when you can actually look at an objective measure like A1C or LDL, uh, that's a step in the right direction. So and she's showing if they're showing effect. So uh, that to me tells me that this isn't just trying to make lifestyle choices or recommendations that are baseless. They're trying very hard to study them in a positive way.
Yeah, and I think that you started describing how their approach could work. So there is a deterministic system that implements evidence rules, and so examines studies and makes rules about when it's appropriate to make recommendation and it's not. It's very important in their model that it is deterministic because it needs to be explainable in a deep way. You need to be able to do the evidence provenance chain all the way back to saying, okay, I made that recommendation because there were 3 studies that supported this and only 1 study that went the other way, right? And I think that's a really good and thoughtful distinction. And then, of course, they have an LLM layer on top of it, which makes authoring recommendations easier, which makes the user interface work better. But they've done an interesting job of splitting the deterministic from the non-deterministic part of the system. That, at least to me, and here I maybe got a little bit fanciful in the episode, but I think it's a pointer at what we're going to describe in a few years as a standard neurosymbolic architecture, right? Where you have symbolic reasoning for verification and traceability, and you have neural networks that do some of the associative thinking and sort of pull out interesting bits from your knowledge base that you want to present. So I think that's a pattern we're likely to see in the future, and theirs is perhaps an early example of it. I don't want to make too much of the linking between the two, but it struck me as a very useful simple prototype of where that world could be going.
And I'll just foreshadow that we have an episode that we're going to be recording later this week. We're in the middle of August right now. with a company that makes the claim that they can dissect out how neural networks actually come to conclusions, how they effectively make decisions. And I'm looking forward to that episode because it in theory at least should help unpack some of the black boxness. Is that even a way to say it? The black box
I would say
approach.
black boxiness. I kind of like that. That sounds like
Black boxing.
fashion. Like
Okay.
black boxiness is in season, and
So we'll have
I
that.
saw it at the Paris Fashion Show, and it looked great.
We'll get to that episode later in the summer, and maybe I think it's going to air sometime in late August or early September. And looking forward to that one, sort of see how that goes. So let's
Yeah.
do
Well,
anything else on
just
this one?
one more thing about about Renee's conversation. The other thing that's worth coming back to and listening is that, I mean, we pushed her for an example that shows that their system can actually eliminate lousy recommendations, and I think she walked us through a good one. There was there's a study that said MCT oil was going to lower your cholesterol, and they said, it was easy for them to make a conclusion that not to make that recommendation because there were 6 other studies that showed that there was no effect, right? And I think it's just that when you're looking at recommendation systems and other consumer-based systems, I think it's just as important to look at where are they rejecting bad recommendations is where they're giving you good recommendations. And, because it's actually really easy to design a system that just says, yes, do everything, take aspirin, exercise, stop drinking coffee, don't drink wine. And you need to, it's easier to eliminate, it's probably harder to eliminate the false positives from the recommendation space. So I thought that was a good thing to kind of to dig into. And that's all I had to say on that one. So if you want to move on to Chris.
Yeah.
Do you-
So Christine Dymek is someone who's become a fast friend. I met her through a colleague of mine who lives in Washington named Joe Bormel. Joe and I trained together in Boston 30 plus years ago. And Joe knows that I'm always on the lookout for interesting people to meet. And, he's a connector kind of guy. And one of the connections he made was Chris Dymek. Chris, unfortunately, had to deal with the change of the administration a couple of years ago. And when the administration came in and decided that a lot of the federal government had to be resized or right sized, her department, the entire department at AHRQ, was downsized and she had to leave. But that hasn't stopped her from becoming an advocate in the domain of AI literacy. Now, AHRQ spent a lot of time early on, and Chris was one of the leaders in this around healthcare literacy. And AHRQ funded a lot of papers and research and surveys and a bunch of different work efforts to put on the button of healthcare literacy, and it's had some impact over the years. Chris has then, as we've seen AI come online, realized pretty early on that just like people need to have their own degree of healthcare literacy, they need to understand if they're going to work with the AI that they need some literacy in how to use these new tools. And this is something that we have been pushing on at the DCI network. We've published, we're in the process. The paper isn't through the pipe just yet. It's still under review, but we wrote a paper about all of this, and it's the kind of thing that the model here is that you wouldn't give, an intern, Leon doesn't like my metaphor, so I'll use a different metaphor. You wouldn't give the intern a cardiac catheter and say, here, go cardiac catheterize a patient. That's a process that takes a lot of education and learning and technical prowess. And once you train, which takes years actually in that case, you then be a junior version of that, of a cardiologist who does interventional cardiology and eventually a professional at it. I don't know why people are looking at AI any different. These tools are insanely powerful and they can be really mishandled, just like a cardiac catheter
Yeah,
can be mishandled.
I think it's because the interface is text, and people assume if they can talk, they can use the new tools, which I think is compelling. And you can certainly get a lot of activity from the new tools by just typing into them, but you won't be able to use them with proficiency. Um, you know, I like your, your example of learning how to use a tool is a good one. I mean, what I always think about is, um, and I use this when the same metaphor when I was trying to explain to students that learning statistics is really requires practice with data sets, right? Like learning the formula and the concepts aren't going to going to make you a proficient statistician. It's if I try to teach you to play the piano and I showed you the musical scales and said, well, that's middle C right there, right? And here's the white notes, the black notes, you got it, right? You're not going to be able to play the piano. You'll be able to repeat what I just said, if you're thoughtful, but you're not playing the piano for a while. So much there's a lot of tacit knowledge that I think is maybe obscured by the fact that you can get early results so quickly and easily. And
They look right,
you know,
right?
and they look right.
they look right.
Yeah. And in fact, you may be getting better results than you would without the tool. You're just not, but you're not getting at the level that somebody who's proficient with the tools is going to be. And you may get a lot of errors and be surprised by them. So, I mean, I thought the conversation was super interesting, and Chris is wonderful and very, very knowledgeable. I mean, I just applaud her for taking that work that AHRQ was doing and just carrying it forward, even as the agency got dismantled.
Yeah.
Because who cares about healthcare quality, right? Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox. Very short aside. But I pressed her on one point that I think, again, like with AI is IT, it's not an objection so much as a question that I'm confused about. And I've wondered when we've talked about literacy, and I heard you talk about literacy, if literacy is the right metaphor here, right? And because if you use the wrong metaphor, you may be importing a lot of assumptions that don't quite fit the model, right? So when we say literacy, we usually we're comparing it to how people were taught to read, right? So we had to develop, and the way it was done is that with considerable investment in institutions, you had to develop schools, and you had to develop literacy programs to catch up people who didn't go to school, and adult literacy and public awareness, and also it was largely, it is something that could be done in a structured learning environment, right? It didn't require the kind of hands-on learn to play a piano thing where you could go to class, at the end, just like, all right, I can read a book now. So I don't know if that metaphor holds for AI. Chris did a really good job of defending the position that it did. I mean, I think she was, it was a good conversation, and I encourage everybody to go back and listen to it, because I think she took on my challenge admirably. And I think, in fact, she is very deliberately comparing it to literacy because she thinks an institutional response is required. Right. I mean, so she was, yeah. But I still, to me, I was convinced by her answer, but I do have that broader concern of, like, are we using that term to import assumptions that aren't warranted?
Well, I'm going to give you a little spoiler, because we got the first round of feedback on our paper a few days
Yeah.
ago. And one of the feedback, we don't know who the critics were, the critiquers were, but one of them said, literacy may not necessarily be enough in that domain. Maybe you also
Yeah.
need to pair it with competency.
Right.
And I think, and we actually took that to heart, and we redrafted a chunk of the paper around the concept of both literacy on one hand and pairing that with competency. Because even in my metaphor around the cardiac catheter, you can be literate with the book knowledge about how to use a catheter, and the same thing with music, your metaphor. But unless you become competent at it, then all that effort doesn't pay off. And right now, the point of the reviewer was that literacy may not be sufficient, either for patients or for clinicians. You need a combination of both literacy and competency. And I think, hopefully that piece of criticism improved our paper, I think, rather dramatically. Hopefully the reviewers will agree.
Yeah, I think you're connecting it to competencies is probably helpful. And I don't know if that's the right answer either. I just know it's worth exploring. I'm glad you guys tackled it in the paper. I also, while I think I am convinced by Chris's argument that some institutional response is required, I don't know what the institutional answer is in this case, right? Do we have the right institutions? because it's not like before literacy was libraries, it was schools, right? We kind of had to invent some new ones. What is it for AI?
Well,
Is it public terminals that sort of, that help people learn, or is it, but yeah,
it
dude, you look like you might have an
it
answer.
might it I don't have answers, but I think we may need to start more locally. I think in a
Mhm.
healthcare institution, it may be up to, um, maybe it's at the institutional level that it helps and train its staff. It might be at the regional level where a medical society takes this on, or another level of regional organization. Maybe AARP takes it on for patients. I mean, I don't know, but I agree with you completely. The metaphor hasn't been completely cast. We don't have the right tools in the system yet to really push this into where it needs to go. And by the way, I don't think this is going to work like self-learning. Like I don't,
Yeah.
it's this is more sophisticated than in some respects learning how to read or learning how to play the piano. I think there's a level of sophistication here, which and it's very seductive that it doesn't need to be. It's so seductive, but I think
Right.
it truly is. People don't quite recognize that just yet.
Or yeah, and we may, have levels of specialization where most people only need a little bit of the
Right.
know-how, and there's layers where, some of us are specialists and some of us are intermediaries and others are just consumers. But I mean, it's a really interesting question. I'm really glad you guys are working on it. It was just a really fun discussion that
So why don't we pivot to our last one? And this was Jeremy Harper. Maybe you want to do the queue
Yeah,
up
I
for
mean,
this one?
I think that I mean Jeremy is somebody we know well from EMEA. He was Chief Research Information Officer at Regenscrief, Indiana University. A exceptionally eminent informatics shop out of Indiana. And recently, he wrote a book called "Large Language Models for Healthcare: A Practical Guide to Their Process and Evaluation." So very topical, right? Jeremy is also somebody who's been working on natural language processing in the 2010s and was very early to the LLM game. I mean, so he's a guy who I think I talked to in like 2022, just as ChatGPT was coming out, and he was way ahead of the curve. I mean, he was using it in very sophisticated and thoughtful ways. It was, he was running local models and, thinking hard about how to manage context, the stuff that, I mean, I think the rest of us took another 2 years to catch up. So I think he's very attentive in the space and sufficiently technically deep to have like a really good perspective on it. So it was just a pleasure to have him on. Um, I mean, I think that there are a number of things that jumped out for me in the conversation. I think, and I don't want to, encourage everybody to just listen to it in its entirety, but a couple of the big takeaways was this point that the adoption curve broke, right? So normally, in like if you think about, crossing the chasm innovation model, right? We all think about early adopters run out and make all the mistakes, right? I include myself in one of them, right? You get excited, you're like, I'm going to try this new tool,
You
and
get
then stuff
excited?
breaks, and
Really?
yeah, I know, only about new technology, and then they try them and they work out the bugs, and then gradually you have sort of the next wave of adopters comes in after them. And then you have the next chunk, and then you have the laggards who you have to drag in, kicking and screaming. And he pointed out something that this is the first wave of technology in healthcare where informaticists are telling people like, hey, you may want to slow this down. We don't know how any of this works yet, right? Or we have concerns. And with tools like ambient listening, right? And with tools like detection of drug interactions, people are just rolling them out, right? And I mean, we heard a very similar thing with Peter, right? Which is, he also said, well, this is the first time in my career where I, as an informaticist, are telling, the clinical, my clinical partners and the execs to like, you guys may
Slow
want to
down.
slow this
Yeah.
down. Like, it's just not our role. We're usually trying to get people, whipping people into a frenzy just to get them over the hill. So I always thought that was an interesting insight because getting the entire crowd to just rush over the line does break some of that feedback cycle when we work out the rough edges with the eager and overly optimistic early adopters. So I don't know what you thought of that, but to me that was a really
I,
interesting take.
yeah, I I think it was an incredibly important insight, frankly. I think, and this is one of the things that has been concerning me, and we've talked about it in this particular episode as well a few minutes ago, that people are, it's a seductive new tool. The tool is so seductive. It makes you believe. And now that hallucinations are becoming a little bit less problematic with RAG and other things, um, your willingness to believe and not, I'm not trying to talk like Ted Lasso, believe, but your willingness to believe is very, very high. And and you called it, what did you call it a few minutes ago? Automation bias. That 80th case, when 79 of the previous notes that have been written look right, and you don't take the time to look at that 80th one, which has an error, that's the seduction part. And it's something that
Yeah.
I think we really, Jeremy called that out, Peter called that out, others have called that out in the course of our podcast over the year. And I don't know how to keep raising the flag on it. I mean, the issue of having a reporting structure at the national level, it's got to happen, I think.
But I mean, Jeremy had a nice phrase that he used. He said, the errors won't matter until they do matter. And it's hard to predict what errors are going to matter ahead of time. So, unfortunately, many of our governance models don't develop until there's a disaster,
Yes, exactly.
right? So often when you see regulation put in place because something terrible happened. So, one response is to sit back and wait for disaster to strike, which to stop. But I think we can do better. I think we can prepare somewhat and have models at the ready. So when disaster does strike, can um, we can actually propose some solutions that are not panicked, right? Like, we want to implement it quickly, but here's some things we've thought about, and you can now roll that out because we're ready. So I also, the other thing that sort of jumped out at me in Jeremy's conversation was his thinking about how AI is likely to roll out to healthcare institutions. He does not think that most providers are going to be paying the exorbitant fees of the Anthropics and OpenAIs of the world. He thinks they're going to be running on-prem models, and I think he had a really good take on why. That's sobering. I mean, these are institutions
Cost
that are
is
very
one thing.
cost.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
they're
cost.
very cost sensitive, right? I mean, the reality is, right, the open source models you can run on prem are quite good, right? I mean, this is a result of tremendous technical progress, and they're right behind the frontier models, and they're not quite they're not quite there, and they're but, and the question is, will a large hospital system, pay hundreds of millions of dollars to get a slightly better, more intelligent model? Not if we can get away with it, right? This is going to be, the same model as NASA, right? Which is, when you're building something you're launching into space, you're going to got a 2 billion pounds of explosives, wrapped around 2 million components, each one built by the lowest bidder.
Yeah.
So, and it doesn't mean it's going to be, it still get into the space, but you're not optimizing for the highest absolute level of quality. You're just setting standards. And I hadn't thought about it until our conversation, and I think he's right. And I wonder what you thought about that.
So first of all, I think he is right. And when it was this week or last week, there's an article in the journal, Wall Street Journal, talking about how some of these less expensive Chinese models are coming out that are open source and are trying to undercut the market from the bigger players for the expressed issue of cost being a part of the challenge. And it'll be like um, economics 101. The dollars will flow where it's the least friction, the least expensive. And if the models prove to be of value and they're not reporting our private lives back to the Chinese Communist Party, like you hear on concerns, let's assume that's not the case. If those less expensive models work, I can't understand why anybody wouldn't go in that direction, frankly. The supply and demand will push things in that direction. Um, and it's, you know, we heard something similar. We're going to foreshadow for a minute that we had another episode coming up in a few weeks from a company called Confido, and their value proposition is having agents that handle front office and back office work in a small practice, and they're pushing on that at a price point which undercuts what a human would be, adds a level of quality, and they're doing it from a strictly economics perspective, and that economics play is what's going to win the day. If a front office staff worker costs, let's say $40,000 a year, but an AI model that does almost everything they do costs, $5,000 a year. That's a pretty, for an office that having 60% overhead, where every percentage point of overhead makes a difference, you better believe they're going to gravitate to that. And the same thing will happen in this other, these larger scales.
Yeah. Are there any overarching themes that we want to look at, across the episodes? I mean, we didn't decided not to twist ourselves into knots to try to synthesize everything into one big lesson. I think that they were diverse and there were a lot of interesting conversations, but there are a couple of things that keep coming up for me. Like one is this concept that human in the loop is just a design commitment, right? And I think that, they came out in, independently in Deehan's episode and Patel's and Harper's, and each one of them talked about it from a different view. I mean, for me, that raises another question, which is, what do we mean by human in the loop design, right? Because there's human in the loop, there's human on the loop, there's probably human under the loop. I don't know what that means yet, but I'm sure we'll figure it out. So,
Leave it
the
to you to coin a
relationship
new
between,
phrase, right? I
yeah,
said,
but
leave
there's a yeah. I mean, I don't know. There's lots of loopy humans around. I'm one of them, but I think that we're trying to think of how do we include human judgment and breaks that increase on confidence that models will be aligned with what humans want to do in systems as they grow increasingly automated. And to me, actually, this is another example where the human in the loop metaphor I just think is insufficient. So I mean, but nevertheless, it's getting a lot of airplay. And I don't know if you want to, do you want to comment on that one, or are there other overarching themes that you thought were worth elevating?
I think you said it quite well. I think the one theme I want to echo a little bit is, we keep hearing from a variety of people that we talk to in this space, and it sort of amplifies my concern about not having not having a national level clearinghouse for errors. We heard it. Peter Embi is working on this regional approach that is taking foot or taking root. But again, that's only in Nashville, right? So if that proves to be a good system, maybe that could be a model for other regions or potentially national. But we're hearing it over and over again, and it's not just us saying it anymore. We're hearing it from other people, and that tells me, number one, that we're on the right path, and number two, it's a real thing. It's a real issue. The other thing that keeps coming up over and over again is the issue of whether we want to call it literacy or literacy plus competency. That one is echoing through our episodes as well, and that keeps coming back again and again. And I think Vimla's issue around how to make these tools so that they are paying attention to how people think and how they work is actually insanely important. If you take too
Yeah.
much of the friction out of the loop and you don't make people think or don't force them, you know what it kind of feels like a little bit? I don't know if this is going to hold or not, but you know how when Duncan Hines made powdered cake and you could do to make the cake, you actually could have just started with a bunch of powder and add a glass of milk, and you whip it up and you have your cake. And this is a business case I learned along the way in the business school. They changed their need from taking powdered eggs in the recipe and forcibly putting real eggs back into the recipe. So people actually had to break the eggs. Now that was a marketing play to sort of force people to think that they're making something or they're baking something, but it was a conscious decision to make it harder. They didn't have to.
Yeah.
I don't know if
But
that
but
metaphor works.
No, I love it because it actually also shows the distinction that you could have, just like we have security theater, you can have judgment theater where people feel like they're actually exercising judgment, but all they're doing is breaking eggs instead of like having mixed in eggs, right? So I like it because it illustrates the duality of what we're trying to do, and it's easy to do it wrong. But I thought it was a really again a great segment. Thanks, Steve, for hanging out and just chatting about these cool conversations. And I do hope our listeners take this not as our poor attempt at a summary, as a way to get you interested in going back and thinking about the details, because they're worth hearing. They're worth hearing from the horse's mouth, right? But with that, I think we need to wrap up. As much fun as it was, and I want to thank Steve for joining this discussion, all of our guests, and I want to thank you, the audience, and look forward to joining all of you again next week on Practical Healthcare, where we're going to have our year in review episode, and we're still trying to figure out what that's going to sound like.
Well, the audience will have to just tune in next week for that now, won't they?
They will find out, and so will we.
All right. Hey, Leon, thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Thank you for joining us this week on Practical AI in Healthcare. If you're ready to go beyond buzzwords and hype and explore how AI is truly transforming healthcare, stay tuned for more conversations that get us to what works. Until next time, stay practical.